Yeah, lovely to be here today. So yeah, Camilla and Elsa just asked me to speak a little bit more about the wider context that a lot of this stuff that we've been discussing this morning sits within, which yeah, at Shared Assets, we do a combination of kind of research work and sort of practical support for people working with land for the common good. But a large part of our work is also around building a movement for land justice in this country. So I'm just going to do a little bit of background, first of all, on why, some of the reasons why that is needed and it's important. So a couple of stats, you may already be aware of this, but land ownership in the UK is one of the most concentrated systems in the whole of Europe. And yeah, just less than 1% of the English population owns over half the land in England, which every time I read that stat, it's shocking to me, even though I've read it a load of times. It's even worse in Scotland. So we have, as the general public, we have very little access to the land around us. And also young people who want to get into farming, which is obviously like a major use of land. About 70% of the land in the country is agricultural. It's very difficult for a new generation of farmers to get into farming because land prices are so high. So yeah, just 3% of agricultural holders at the minute are under 35. And when that's so important, and with the things Jack was talking about earlier about kind of the new scheme of subsidies and the new agricultural landscape we are having after Brexit, it's really important to address that. And another reason is farming is one of the least diverse professions, vocations there is. I think it's something like 97.8% of farmers are white, which is, yeah, shocking. But it's no wonder when land prices are so high that anybody who doesn't have a kind of family background in it, and to be honest, even those who do, find it very difficult to access farmland. And yeah, a lot of that comes back down to land prices. And as I think, you know, we've been talking about throughout today, land ownership and management have always been and continue to be at the root of power relations. So yeah, I just see, and at Shared Assets, we kind of talk about land at being at the foundations of so many other issues in society. So whether that's having access to affordable housing or a healthy environment to go for a walk in or somewhere to grow or access healthy, fresh food, land is just at the center of this, and who has control over it and access to it has always been the way that people have consolidated power, and yeah, continues to affect all of us in different ways to this day. I was also going to mention the sort of police crime sentencing bill, which has already been brought up. That again kind of has land at its root, because if we don't have the space to protest, then yeah, if you don't have a right to be on the land to protest, then that's a big issue for yeah, all sorts of reasons. And it also depends or can affect, you know, in public space, people who feel safest. We've also already talked about kind of the gender and racial aspects of that, but in terms of, you know, tackling things like police brutality, sexual harassment, all of these things at their base kind of is around access to land and who has control over it. So I just wanted to set the scene a little bit with some of that background. And I also wanted to kind of root it in where we are, at least in person today in Cambridge. So some of you might know that in 2020, there was a report that came out that said that Cambridge is the most unequal city in the UK. So there's a huge difference between the kind of wealthy university core of the city and the kind of outskirts. And again, a lot of that comes back to land, things like affordable housing and food and things like that. As we've talked about, a lot of the ownership in Cambridge and the surrounding area is dominated by the colleges and the university. And there's been a lot of change. I've lived in Cambridge for about 10 or 12 years now, and there's been a massive change in the sort of landscape of the city in the time I've been here, and that's only going to continue with the sort of the plans that are in the Greater Cambridge Local Plan over the next decade or so. And I think when thinking about all of these things, we have to think about who are these changes for, who is the land benefiting, who gets to have those sort of meaningful relationships with the land that Anita mentioned and everyone else this morning. So I think we constantly have to have that idea or that question in our mind of who is this land for, and what does that mean in terms of justice and equality. So a bit of the work that Shared Assets with some other organisations has been doing in the last year or so has been thinking about what are the narratives around land that we hold in England specifically. So just to define what I mean by narratives, I'm talking about the kind of deep patterns in our culture that determine what is seen as a priority and what is kind of dismissed and put aside. And these narratives come out through media, through the way we kind of talk to each other. So this sort of messages and stories that we tell each other, but they're underlain by our deeper values and worldview. So we did a bit of work kind of investigating how is land talked about in the media, and like who are sort of the characters in that story, if you like, who appears as like the people with power and the people with no say in things at all. And through this work, we came up with this sort of a bunch of frames, if you like, which I'll just talk through a little bit. So the first frame that we came up with was this one that land is often talked about as the settled outcome of history. So this has been hinted at a little bit today as well. It's like in a lot of the sort of stories and narratives we hear, we often hear that like, you know, the land system's the way it's been for hundreds of years. There's no way to change it now. Like these things are set in stone and there's no point like messing with it basically. And the kind of counter frame, or like the frame that's presented when people think, actually, what if we did change something, is that change is presented as kind of dangerous and destabilizing for everybody, whether or not that would really be the case. But, you know, there's sort of all this talk about like mob rule and seizures and like complete chaos. So we shouldn't try and change anything because, you know, it might be dangerous for everybody, even if that's not really true that it would be dangerous for everybody. But anyway, on the other side, and I'll get into the division between these two in a second, is a kind of narrative that, you know, we're an island nation, land is scarce, and everybody's just got to get their piece and kind of do what they want with it. And obviously that feeds into all sorts of kind of xenophobic, bigoted narratives. There's actually plenty of space in the country if it wasn't completely dominated by like a very small percentage of people having access to or ownership over most of the land. But anyway, like there's this kind of narrative that comes through that we all just need to claim our bit and kind of exploit it for all it's worth. And the sort of the counter narrative a little bit to that is that any change that does happen, it's not really for most people. It's kind of just for like a fringe group of people, maybe people who are like privileged enough to go and like start, I don't know, a commune in the countryside or something, but it's not something that like everybody can do. So again, there's no point really, you know, wasting our time on that. So these two kind of sets of narratives, both of them, even though they're coming at it at different angles of like defending the land and exploiting the land, in a way, they both have this narrative of land as being something that's vulnerable to people. So it doesn't leave a lot of room for a kind of more mutually beneficial or meaningful relationship with the land. The only ways that we can relate to it are usually presented as either defending it or exploiting it. And the thing is that even people trying to do more progressive things with the land, like say, you know, a rewilding project or something like that, it's easy to fall into these traps as well of like, well, we've just got to get this bit of land that we can do our, you know, rewilding or our community food project on. And that kind of feeds into the scarcity narrative. So there's different ways that even if you're trying to do something a bit different, you can fall into these sort of traps. So we tried to talk to a lot of people involved in the land system at the minute and come up with what might be a sort of new narrative for the land, which I hope, yeah, this just about fits on the screen. So these are some of the things that we came up with, and I'm going to show a very short video that'll kind of explain it in a little bit more detail. But we tried to look at some of the shared values that people, even across the different political viewpoints and the different kind of frames that I just showed, could maybe agree on. So they kind of center around these three things of making more of what we have, the land as being a place where we can heal and get better and connect together, and also a place where there's whole new horizons of possibilities and realities and lifestyles. So yeah, I'm going to just show a video for a couple of minutes, which kind of goes into this in a nicer way. I'm really hoping it works for the people on Zoom. There's like an instrumental soundtrack, but there's no sound that you're missing out on. So yeah, anyway, but the people in here can hear the sound at least. So yeah, that sums it up more poetically than I could have maybe. But I think, yeah, it really speaks to, I think with COVID, everybody's been thinking a lot more about, our access to green space and all these sorts of things where our food comes from. So it's a time where we really can affect change. And yeah, it's a really exciting movement to be part of at the minute. So I just wanted to showcase a couple of examples, some local, some not. Like I said in the video, we already have the leaders and the people who are doing this work. So it's not like we're starting from scratch. So a couple of here, we've got Wolves Lane in London. So this is a set of former council glass houses, which are now a centre for growers of colour who are running a whole range of kind of growing initiatives to help with some of that inequality in terms of access to land and farming for Black people and people of colour in particular, and produce kind of culturally appropriate food for the wood green area where it's situated. So that's one way. Another one is Chiltern Rangers in Buckinghamshire. So this is a group that kind of has license agreements with the council to run all sorts of environmental maintenance projects. So they do a lot of work with young people, a lot of training. And again, it's just another way, even though they don't actually own the land themselves, but it's a way for people to form different sort of connections, deeper connections with their local land. And then I want to give a shout out to two Cambridge projects as well you might well be aware of. One is Co-Farm, which is up on Coldham's Common. So it's a 7-hectare market garden, and they do volunteering every week. I'd really encourage you to go along. It's great fun. You often get free food. And it was started just at the start of the pandemic, and they've kind of set it up. And I've been donating so far all the food to the food hubs, food banks around the city, and it's all organic and agroecological. So yeah, it's a brilliant place to get involved with. And I also wanted to give a shout out to the Loch On, which is an occupation in the former Hopvine pub on Fair Street near the Grafton Centre. And I mainly love the building because they've got so much cool land rights graffiti all over it. But they also run a thing called Cambridge Community Kitchen, which is a mutual aid, like a meal scheme. So we deliver like free meals to anyone who wants them 3 times a week. You can sign up as a volunteer, or you can sign up to get meals anytime you want. But it's just all these sorts of people who are like showing the seeds of what the new system around land could be. So I just wanted to give a few examples there. And like I said, there are tons of people doing this work. It is not just shared assets. It is the land justice movement is huge, and we need as many people as possible because there's so many different issues that it affects, like I said. So yeah, if you're interested in any of this stuff, like please check out some of the people here. Just to mention a couple, we've got the Land Workers Alliance, which is a union of small-scale farmers, foresters, and other land workers. Yeah, doing a lot of work around this sort of transition in terms of agricultural policy at the minute. And we've also got Land in Our Names, which is a Black-led collective of people doing work on reparations and kind of, yeah, ensuring that people of colour have are able to have meaningful relationships with the land as well. So yeah, check all of them out, and there's loads more as well. But just to come into the end, I wanted to flash up this kind of diagram for a bit, because this is something that kind of helps me think through how system change happens. So this, you might have seen this before. It came from the Berkana Institute, I think. It's called the 2 loops model. And it shows how the dominant system that we have in any given situation and emergent systems can kind of emerge from that. So it shows that there's often within the dominant system, so if you think of that as the land system that we have at the minute, there's often these pioneers or leaders, you know, some of which were shown in that video, who have these kind of creative ideas and want to make change. And they connect together and they build networks and they build collective power, basically. So they grow in influence, and they can eventually become the more dominant system, hopefully a more progressive dominant system. But at the same time, there's a lot of work that needs to happen to sort of hospice, or if you like, compost the old system, to do that in a sort of, in a good way and not a sort of like really traumatic or difficult way. And there's obviously points from the old system that you might still want to take with you. So there's also this work of transition. And yeah, in preparing for this talk, I was kind of thinking about, I think all of the speakers today and probably lots of you listening as well are involved in different parts of this diagram. So like, maybe we see the kind of rights of way stuff as something that we would want to transition from the old system to the new system. But then there's probably lots of other little networks and practices that we also want to build up as part of the new system. So I don't know, when the work of like changing the land system gets a bit much, I just like to think about this diagram and how change happens. And we need people doing like work at all parts of this. So yeah, there's loads to get involved in. And I just wanted to, we're nearly at the end now, but I just wanted to share in full this quote from Sam Siva, who's part of Land in Our Names and also the Right to Roam campaign. And this came from a talk that they gave at the Oxford Real Farming Conference with Corinne Fowler called Land, Race and Empire, which I've linked to at the end of my presentation. I would encourage you to watch. They go into loads of stuff about, yeah, the colonial history of our countryside and land systems. But I just wanted to take this quote in particular, and especially the last line that, so I'll just read it out. If people have more of a right to access the countryside for their own mental health and well-being, and the majority of people who live in polluted urban areas are Black and people of colour, they are able to develop relationships with the more than human and nature. And then you realise that there are things being withheld from you, being taken from you, and that can be a call to action. And I kind of think that's what today's event is a lot about. It's like, until you can even form even a small relationship with a piece of land or a right of way or something like that, you don't even necessarily know that so much is withheld from you. So I think, yeah, rights of way and other relationships with the land are so important as a call to action to move from the system that we have to maybe the futures that we'd want to see. And I would just emphasize that, like, yeah, no system is set in stone forever, as big and like as all-consuming as it might seem. And that's why I like that diagram from the last page. So like, there are already people sort of living the futures that we might want to see more widely, and we need to link up and build power and yeah, work together to make that more widespread. So in that vein, I was wondering if everybody might humor me for a minute or so. We all have like a connection with the land in some way, and for some of us it might be much more distant, it might be much more traumatic, or it might be something, you know, that you don't really feel like you have a connection with yet, but you would like to. So what I'd like everybody to do for just like 30 seconds even is just kind of close your eyes and think about what is your land story, or what is your connection to the land. And you might draw on sort of childhood memories or your current situation, but also think about what would you like your land story to be. So I'm just going to be quiet for like 30 seconds. Maybe everyone can think about that for a second. Okay. I'm actually running a little bit ahead of time, so I might ask if anybody feels like sharing a part of their land story. If not, that's fine. People in the chat also feel free to share them there. But if anybody feels like sharing anything that came to mind, I'd love to hear it. Yeah.
Share. So for me, it's like fear. It's like fear of landing, falling, slipping, and dying. And instead of that, I use the software that
Thank you for sharing. Yeah, I think that sort of the fear around land is such, it's present for many of us because it's a struggle to connect with it. We don't have those experiences. So yeah, I think that is, yeah, a really important thing to share as well. We're not in this beautiful sort of utopia yet. Yeah, go ahead.
And I think growing up, I would like the teach stuff that we do that is that more people walk on them, because often I would see anyone else.
Yeah, that's lovely as well. Thank you. So like, yeah, I think there's always much more to discover and like deepen in our relationships, even with a small area that you know very well. And I totally agree. It would be great to see not just people walking, but so many people on the land, working the land, having a relationship with it in all sorts of different ways. So yeah, brilliant. Anyone else just quickly? Or I don't know if there's anything coming up in the chat. Yes. Well, yeah, basically for the people in the Zoom room, we just had some really nice little stories about, well, one about kind of fear around the land, and another one about kind of discovering new places to walk through, and wanting to see kind of more people having access to do that. Is there? Can I see it? Oh, without wrecking everything.
Yeah, if you go to the top of the screen,
Yes. So unintentionally and later intentionally trespassing on private land with my sister growing up. Feeling attached to a place you don't own feels like resistance to the current system of ownership. Absolutely. Yeah, I think that's really cool. And again, I think it speaks to the, yeah, this kind of quote here of like, you realize what's being taken from you. So I think there's a lot of work to do, and I think the Right to Roam campaign are doing some really good work around that and organising trespasses and things at the minute, and also making those accessible for more people, because obviously it's one thing if, I don't know, you're a relatively privileged white person trying to do that sort of action versus, yeah, people who are more vulnerable to police brutality and things like that. So yeah, there's work being done on that, and I know Sam's involved in that. Oh, is there? Okay. I might, well, let me see how much time I got left. I'll do one more maybe. Let me see, chat. We might get to that. So growing up, exploring everywhere, didn't stick to footpaths, just explored. Now it feels like you can't step off any path, and the paths we have are not maintained, not made accessible, and I felt threatened in my own village. Yeah. I agree. I think it's amazing what a barrier, just even like a small sign or something not being very like accessible or clear to get through, is to engaging with the land and exploring new places. And yeah, I mean, I think the whole Rights of Way and Don't Lose Your Way campaign and things are doing excellent work on that. But there's a whole other piece of work around changing that narrative, right? From one of kind of like fear to a more sort of forgiving and graceful and fulfilling relationship, I'd say. I'm looking forward to coming back to the chat, but I'm just going to move on quickly. Not that way. So yeah, we're in an effort to kind of like make more people's land stories, or partial land stories or future land stories kind of heard. We're running a little sort of social media campaign at the minute called #WithLandWe. So if you're interested in kind of just sharing a little bit, maybe even like making a little video or a tweet or something, you can go to that link in our link tree at the bottom, and there's a little form you can fill in. And yeah, hopefully we're going to be sharing all sorts of people's different land stories, because like I said, like it's often the same people who you hear talking about land a lot, and they don't represent everyone. So we want to get as broad a range of people as possible. So yeah, I think I'll stop there, and I'm excited to take questions. And yeah, please come and talk to me like afterwards if you want to hear more about shared assets or any of the work we do, because I didn't really get into that. But yeah, thank you very much.